Welcome, wanderer of the night. You have found your way here perhaps with a cup of tea cooling beside you, or maybe with the faint hum of the world outside your window ready to drift somewhere far away from the ordinary. Tonight, we open a doorway to another time, one wrapped in fog and firelight, where stone towers reach into misty skies and the sound of horse hooves echoes through cobbled courtyards. This is not the world of fairy tales, though it might look like one at first. It is the world of medieval royalty, the kings and queens whose faces once adorned coins, whose commands could change the fate of thousands, and whose lives, for all their wealth and ceremony, were often more fragile and uncertain than we imagine. Before we step inside those high castle walls, take a moment to picture it, a chill morning in 12th century Europe. A castle fortress stands on a hill, its battlements cutting through the mist. The drawbridge creaks, the river below glints in the pale dawn light. Inside, the corridors smell faintly of smoke, tallow, and rushes scattered to muffle footsteps. Servants hurry through narrow halls carrying jugs of hot water. In the great hall, a fire burns low, embers glowing red against the grey stone. And somewhere above, behind heavy oak doors, the king begins to stir. The court will awaken soon. Bells from the chapel will toll, echoing across the courtyard. Guards will change shift, kitchens will light their hearths, and a new day in the life of royalty will begin, a day that looks, from the outside, like a dream of luxury. But inside those walls, reality is far more complex. Because behind the silk curtains and jeweled crowns lies a truth few ever saw. Being royal in the Middle Ages was not simply about privilege. It was about survival. Royalty in the medieval world was not just a status. It was a role, a constant performance played out before the eyes of nobles, priests, and commoners alike. The moment a monarch woke, their day was scripted. From the clothes they wore to the prayers they uttered, from the way they sat at table to the gestures they made during Mass, every movement was steeped in symbolism. To rule was to live beneath a gaze that never looked away. For us, centuries later, it is easy to imagine kings and queens as distant figures, untouchable, glittering icons painted on parchment or carved in marble. But the truth is softer, more human. They woke up cold. They got sick. They laughed, argued, and sometimes broke under pressure. The Middle Ages were an era of contradictions, splendor and squalor, faith and fear, luxury and loss, and nowhere were those contradictions sharper than in the lives of the people who wore the crown. So tonight, instead of reading history from the outside, let us slip quietly into the inside of it. Let us see what the world looked like through royal eyes. Imagine, for a moment, you are that king or queen. You were born into this world of power not by choice, but by blood. From the day you drew your first breath, your life was mapped out, who you would marry, what alliances you would form, even how you would pray. You have never known the kind of freedom your subjects take for granted, the freedom to wander, to choose, to vanish into anonymity. Every gesture you make carries weight. Every silence could be read as weakness. The crown glitters, but it also binds. As the dawn breaks, a soft knock sounds at your chamber door. It is your groom of the stool, the most trusted servant, though his duties are far from glamorous. He is followed by attendants carrying basins of warm water and cloths of fine linen. You rise carefully from the heavy bed, your breath visible in the cool air. They dress you layer by layer, shirt, tunic, hose, cloak, all woven from the richest fabrics the realm can afford. The garments are symbols as much as clothing, each color and jewel chosen to declare your divine right to rule. Outside, the chapel bells call you to morning mass. Religion shapes every hour of your life. You kneel before the altar, reciting Latin prayers you have known since childhood. The incense curls upward. The candles flicker, and for a fleeting moment, amid the chant of monks, you feel something close to peace. But it does not last. There is always another petition waiting, another decision to make, another grievance to hear. As monarch, you are expected to embody two things at once, the warrior and the saint. You must lead armies and build cathedrals, crush rebellions and feed the poor. You must be feared and loved in equal measure and impossible balance. Fail to show strength, and your nobles will test you. Show too much cruelty, and your people will curse your name. Every royal figure in medieval Europe walked this line. Some stumbled and fell into ruin. Others mastered the art so well that centuries later, we still remember them. But before we meet those names, before Eleanor of Aquitaine, before Empress Matilda, before Edward and Philippa, it is worth lingering a little longer in this moment of stillness, at the threshold between dream and duty. Royal mornings were rituals in themselves. The bedchamber was not just a private space. It was a theater of power. Courtiers and attendants would wait in hushed rows as the monarch rose. Even something as mundane as washing one's face or breaking fast became a ceremony of divine authority. A squire might hand the king a golden basin of water. The queen's ladies-in-waiting would unfold her robes and arrange her hair, each gesture performed with precision. And yet, amid the ritual, there was a flicker of vulnerability, a human being beneath layers of silk and expectation. This was the rhythm of royal life, endless ceremony masking ordinary fragility. When the trumpets blared and the gates opened, the world saw majesty. Behind the scenes, they saw fatigue. When the banners waved in triumph, they hid the sleepless nights, the whispers of rebellion, the quiet moments of prayer. And perhaps that is why their stories still draw us in. Because beneath every crown lies the same fragile truth: power can dazzle, but it can never erase humanity. Tonight, as we drift deeper into this tale, remember that history is not just about thrones and battles, it is about people. People who loved, feared, hoped, and doubted. People whose hearts beat beneath robes of gold, whose sighs echoed in the same silence that greets us now. So settle back, let the candlelight of imagination flicker to life, and follow me through those towering gates. The castle awaits, and behind its stone walls, the strange and beautiful world of medieval royalty is about to begin. The daily life of medieval royalty was a carefully choreographed dance of ritual and duty, wrapped in velvet and expectation. Every hour belonged to someone else: the church, the court, the people, or the crown itself. To live as a king or queen was to exist inside a clock that never stopped ticking. The day began not with solitude, but with ceremony. The monarch's awakening was a public event, attended by courtiers, servants, and officials, each performing their assigned roles. The simple act of rising from bed was transformed into a statement of power. From the first light of dawn, there was always an audience. The morning toilette was an affair of hierarchy and privilege. Servants helped the monarch wash, dress, and prepare for the day, but each gesture carried meaning. To be allowed to hand the king a towel, or to lace the queen's gown, was an honor that could elevate a courtier's standing. Even in private, every movement reinforced the invisible chain of command. The chamber was filled with murmured greetings, whispered prayers, the rustle of silk, the faint clink of jewelry. Beneath it all lingered the scent of beeswax, incense, and freshly laid rushes on the stone floor. Breakfast, when it came, was modest by modern standards: bread, cheese, perhaps a spiced wine or ale, but even that was a matter of etiquette. The monarch could not simply eat. Food was served in order of rank, blessed by the chaplain, and sometimes tasted first by a servant to guard against poison. Every meal was both nourishment and theater, a performance of generosity and control. After the meal came the true business of the day: governance. The king would hold audience in the great hall, seated on a high throne beneath a canopy of gold-threaded fabric. Nobles, clerics, and petitioners lined up to present disputes, land claims, and pleas for mercy. A royal seal pressed into wax could change a person's fate forever. Yet amid this spectacle of authority, the ruler often sat in a kind of isolation, surrounded by voices but alone in decision. Power, in its purest form, was a solitary burden. The queen's day followed a different rhythm. Her mornings were spent in correspondence, household management, or religious devotion. She oversaw servants, ordered supplies, and sometimes advised her husband in matters of diplomacy. Queens were expected to embody virtue and grace. Yet they also carried political weight. Their marriages were alliances, their children, living treaties. Behind the tapestry-covered walls, the queen's chambers were places of both influence and constraint. She could shape opinions with a word or gesture, but she could not freely choose her path. By midday, the court was alive with noise. Pages hurried through corridors with messages, the clang of armor echoed from the training yard, and musicians tuned their instruments for the evening feast. The smell of roasting meat drifted from the kitchens, mingling with the chill of the stone halls. Courtiers gathered in small groups, gossiping softly about alliances, betrayals, and scandals. Every castle was a labyrinth of whispers. Afternoons brought hunts, meetings, or inspections of lands. A royal hunt was not only recreation. It was a symbol of strength and command over nature. The king rode at the center of a glittering procession, hawks on wrists, hounds straining at the leash. The forest echoed with horns, shouts, and the pounding of hooves. Each successful hunt reaffirmed the monarch's dominion, a reminder to the court that he ruled both man and beast. For the queen and her ladies, afternoons were filled with embroidery, reading, or walking in enclosed gardens. It was a quieter world, yet no less political. Conversations during needlework or strolls often carried coded meanings. A glance or phrase could hint at alliances forming in secret. In the medieval court, even leisure was strategic. As evening fell, the castle transformed. Torches flickered along the walls, and the great hall filled with light and laughter. Musicians played lutes and harps, jesters performed, and nobles dined at long tables covered with silver goblets and roasted pheasants. The monarch presided at the high table, smiling as wine was poured and stories told. But beneath the music and mirth lay an unspoken rule. Everything seen in the hall was part of the image of power. Every toast, every smile, every nod had to be deliberate. When the feast ended, prayers closed the day. The monarch would retreat once again to the private chambers, though true privacy was rare. Even in the quiet of night, servants lingered nearby, guards stood at the door, and scribes waited with documents needing the royal seal. Sleep came late, often restless. For the rulers of the medieval world, the mind never truly rested. The crown, invisible yet ever-present, pressed its weight against every dream. And so the cycle continued day after day, year after year. To the people below the castle walls, the monarch's life seemed effortless, golden banquets, shining crowns, a destiny ordained by heaven. But inside those walls, the truth was far more human. A royal life was not a life of freedom, but of duty measured, observed, and endlessly repeated. In that routine, some found purpose. Others found only quiet despair. Yet together they built the rhythm of a world where power was as fragile as glass, and every sunrise brought both glory and danger. Power in the medieval world was not a gift. It was a test. Every decision a monarch made, every alliance, every punishment, every war was a measure of how well they could carry the invisible weight of expectation. A king or queen did not simply rule by will. They ruled by the consent of heaven, or so the world believed. Their authority was said to come from God, yet the challenges they faced came from men, ambitious nobles, restless armies, and the unpredictable tide of fate. The throne was a battlefield of its own. Each day brought new letters from distant lords, reports from spies, and pleas from the church. The ruler had to be judge and general, father and executioner. The line between mercy and weakness was perilously thin. A single wrong choice, a tax too high, a delay in justice, an insult to the clergy could spark rebellion. Power was a flame that had to be fed constantly, but never allowed to burn too bright. In the medieval imagination, a monarch was both mortal and divine. They were expected to embody strength, wisdom, and piety all at once, though few could truly live up to such ideals. Behind the polished ceremonies lay the constant fear of losing control. A failed harvest could turn loyalty into anger. A rumor could undo years of peace. One moment of hesitation could invite invasion or betrayal. The crown offered glory, but it also demanded endless vigilance. To understand that balance, imagine again the king seated in council. Around him are his barons, each powerful, each proud, each with armies of their own. They bow in respect, but their loyalty is thin as parchment. Some serve for reward, others from fear, and a few because rebellion has not yet seemed worth the cost. The monarch must speak carefully, never showing uncertainty. A ruler who wavers invites bloodshed. The queen, too, carries her share of that burden. Her words at court may sound gentle, but each carries weight. She must soothe tempers, ease rivalries, and guide her husband's ear. At times, she acts as mediator between factions. At others, as a silent strategist. Her role may seem secondary in ceremony, but within the hidden politics of the palace, her influence could shape kingdoms. Yet she is always walking a narrow path, one misstep, and whispers of ambition or sin could destroy her reputation forever. Responsibility extended far beyond the court. Monarchs were expected to act as moral examples for their people. They funded churches and monasteries, distributed alms to the poor, and led religious processions on holy days. But such gestures were never merely spiritual. They were instruments of legitimacy. A pious king was harder to dethrone. A charitable queen inspired devotion that armies could not buy. Still, the illusion of divine authority did not shield them from exhaustion. Some kings, like Henry II or Edward III, ruled with relentless energy, rarely resting, convinced that the kingdom's fate rested entirely on their will. Others faltered, crushed by the sheer scale of responsibility. Chroniclers wrote of rulers who wept in private, who confessed their fears to priests in the dead of night. They knew the truth that history often hides: the higher one climbs, the lonelier it becomes. At the heart of that loneliness was a simple reality: no one could ever truly understand the crown except those who wore it. To be a monarch was to live at the center of every storm, admired and envied, blessed and cursed. The royal body itself was considered sacred, yet it was never truly their own. Every gesture, every illness, every rumor about their private life became a matter of national concern. The body of the king was the body of the state. If he weakened, so did the realm. Yet for all the pressure, some rulers found a strange kind of purpose in it. They saw power not as privilege, but as duty and inheritance that demanded constant labor. They built roads, negotiated peace, strengthened laws, and brought order to lands once torn by chaos. For them, the crown was not just a symbol of control but of stewardship. Their legacy, they believed, would outlive them not in gold or glory, but in the quiet stability they left behind. Still, others were consumed by the very force they wielded. They ruled with iron and fear, mistaking obedience for loyalty. Their courts filled with flatterers instead of truth-tellers. They built monuments to themselves while their people starved outside the gates. Power, in the end, is a mirror. It reflects what already lives within. Those who ruled with wisdom left peace behind. Those who ruled with pride left ruins. In the medieval world, every crown was a crossroads between greatness and downfall. And the strangest truth of all is that most monarchs never truly knew which path they walked until it was too late. From the outside, their reigns seemed destined. From the inside, they were fragile balancing acts, held together by fear, faith, and sheer endurance. So when we think of those rulers, of their gleaming halls and golden thrones, it is worth remembering the quiet truth beneath the spectacle. Power, no matter how divine it seems, always comes with a cost. And for the kings and queens of the Middle Ages, that cost was everything: their peace, their privacy, and often their humanity. Faith was the pulse of medieval royalty, the invisible thread woven through every act of governance and every breath of daily life. To rule was not only a political duty but a spiritual calling. Monarchs were taught from birth that their crowns were granted by heaven, that every triumph was divine approval, and every failure a test from God. Religion was not an ornament of power, it was its foundation. Without faith, a king was just another man with a sword. The first sound a ruler often heard in the morning was not the trumpet of ceremony but the ringing of chapel bells. From the smallest baronial estate to the grandest royal fortress, prayer marked the rhythm of the day. Kings and queens attended mass before breaking fast, kneeling before altars lit by flickering candles, their hands heavy with rings that gleamed in the candlelight. Behind them stood bishops and confessors, men who whispered scripture and shaped policy in equal measure. The cross and the crown were inseparable. But religion did more than comfort the royal soul, it justified their rule. The medieval concept of divine right made the monarch the earthly vessel of God's will. To disobey the king was to defy heaven itself. This idea bound kingdoms together, giving political authority a sacred aura. The coronation ritual was the purest expression of that belief. The anointing oil, placed upon the monarch's forehead by the archbishop, transformed a mortal into something more, a ruler chosen, not elected. The moment the crown touched their head, their life ceased to be their own. Faith also set the moral tone of the royal household. Every action, from marriage to warfare, was expected to reflect divine order. Kings founded monasteries and cathedrals not only as acts of devotion but as monuments to their righteousness. Queens sponsored hospitals, almshouses, and shrines, weaving mercy into the fabric of their legacy. Religious festivals filled the calendar: Advent, Easter, Pentecost, each accompanied by processions, feasts, and public prayers. Yet beneath the grandeur lay quiet fear. To offend the church was to risk not only rebellion but damnation. The clergy, meanwhile, held immense influence. Bishops served as royal advisors, confessors, and diplomats. A king might trust no noble at court, but he would kneel before his priest in confession. Many rulers carried personal chaplains even on campaign, turning war tents into mobile chapels. Before battle, they prayed for victory. After bloodshed, for forgiveness. In those moments, the line between faith and politics blurred completely. A crusade could be both holy mission and conquest. A sermon, both worship and propaganda. For queens, faith offered both refuge and constraint. They were expected to embody purity, charity, and obedience, virtues that mirrored the Virgin Mary herself. A devout queen could wield influence through piety, becoming the moral compass of her court. Yet religion also confined them within rigid ideals. To stray from the image of saintly womanhood was to invite suspicion, even condemnation. Some, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, defied that mold and paid dearly for it. Others, like Saint Margaret of Scotland, embraced devotion so deeply that sanctity became their power. Faith shaped not just behavior but the architecture of royal life. In every castle, the chapel stood at the heart, a sanctuary carved in stone, filled with the scent of incense and the echo of Gregorian chant. Its windows told stories of saints and martyrs, of trials and redemption. When kings and queens entered, they knelt beneath those glowing figures, reminded that even divine rulers must answer to something greater than themselves. Yet belief could also torment them. Some monarchs saw every illness, every rebellion, as punishment for their sins. They fasted, prayed, or funded churches to atone for imagined faults. Others grew disillusioned, questioning the justice of a God who blessed one war and cursed another. Chroniclers tell of Henry II flogging himself after Becket's death, of Louis IX marching barefoot on crusade, of queens who spent their last days in cloisters seeking peace no crown could give. Faith, for medieval royalty, was both comfort and shame. It gave their reigns legitimacy but bound their consciences in fear. It crowned them with light and haunted their dreams with judgment. Their lives were lived in the long shadow of eternity, a reminder that even the most powerful were, in the end, only pilgrims moving toward the same uncertain salvation as everyone else. So when the king knelt in the dark chapel, the crown resting beside him on the cold stone floor, he prayed not just for victory or wisdom. He prayed for mercy for himself, for his kingdom, and for the fragile balance between heaven and earth that defined his world. If the medieval world ever produced a figure who defied every rule written for queens, it was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Her name still lingers like perfume in the corridors of history, rebellious, brilliant, impossible to contain. She was both legend and scandal, a woman who shaped empires with her mind as much as her beauty. Born into wealth and culture, heir to one of the richest duchies in Europe, she was not raised to obey quietly. She was raised to rule. Eleanor lived in a century when women were expected to be silent, pious, and still. She was none of those things. From her youth, she was known for her wit, her education, and her defiant confidence. While most noblewomen were trained in embroidery and etiquette, Eleanor was schooled in philosophy, poetry, and politics. Her court in Poitiers became the birthplace of courtly love, a movement that transformed how Europe thought about passion, loyalty, and chivalry. Beneath the songs of troubadours and the perfume of roses, she was quietly shaping the moral vocabulary of an age. At 15, she married Louis VII of France, becoming queen before she had truly grown into herself. Louis was devout, serious, and hesitant, everything Eleanor was not. Their marriage, strained from the start, became a mirror of their opposing natures. When Louis took her on the Second Crusade, she rode across continents at his side, armored, unyielding, commanding her own retinue of soldiers. Chronicles say she marched like a queen of legend, defying the heat of Antioch and the expectations of men who called her reckless. But when she offered counsel, they called her prideful. When she led, they called her dangerous. Their union unraveled under the weight of ambition and misunderstanding. Louis sought salvation. Eleanor sought purpose. By the time they returned to France, they were strangers bound by ceremony. The annulment that followed was both liberation and scandal, a queen leaving a king, walking away from divine marriage as though from a failed alliance. In the eyes of the Church, it was shocking. In the eyes of history, it was courage. Not long after, Eleanor made a decision that would alter the fate of Europe. She married Henry Plantagenet, the future Henry II of England. If Louis had been restraint, Henry was fire. Together, they created one of the most powerful dynasties of the Middle Ages, ruling vast lands from the Pyrenees to the northern seas. Their marriage began with passion and intellect, two rulers who understood the machinery of power too well to play by anyone else's script. But such brilliance in one household was never meant to coexist peacefully. Eleanor bore 8 children, including 2 future kings, Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland, yet even motherhood became a battlefield. As Henry's empire expanded, so did his control and Eleanor's frustration. She refused to fade into the background. When her sons rebelled against their father, she sided with them, urging them to claim the authority she once wielded beside Henry. It was an act of defiance few women in history dared. For that, Henry imprisoned her. 17 years, that is how long she spent confined in castles and towers, her freedom reduced to the size of a cell. Yet even there, she remained formidable. Her mind became her weapon, her endurance, her rebellion. When Henry died, her chains were broken, and she emerged not as a broken prisoner but as a queen regent guiding her son Richard's reign with a steadiness that astonished Europe. She negotiated treaties, arranged marriages, and even rode across mountains in her 70s to rescue her grandson from captivity. Eleanor of Aquitaine was not just a queen, she was the pulse of her century. She outlived 2 husbands, 8 children, and an empire's worth of enemies. History remembers her as passionate and proud, but what made her extraordinary was something quieter, a relentless refusal to be defined by the limitations of her age. In a world that saw women as possessions, she became a force. Her story stands as proof that power wears many faces, not all of them crowned by men. Eleanor ruled through intellect, endurance, and will. She navigated the dangerous waters of medieval politics not by pretending to be less, but by daring to be fully herself. Even her flaws, her temper, her ambition, her stubbornness were the tools that kept her alive in a time when most women's names were forgotten the moment they died. When she finally retired to the Abbey of Fontevraud, the place where she would one day be buried beside both Henry and Richard, she did not vanish into repentance or regret. She turned the monastery into a seat of quiet power, a place where rulers came seeking her counsel. In her final years, the woman who once rode across Crusader deserts and rebelled against kings spent her mornings in prayer, her afternoons in letters, her evenings watching the slow turn of seasons through cloistered arches. If faith had been the weight of kings, endurance was the crown of Eleanor. She had learned that true power does not come from commanding armies or signing decrees, but from surviving, from holding one's ground when the world tries to silence you. And perhaps that is why, centuries later, her shadow still falls across history like the echo of a storm that refused to end. Before Eleanor's fire, there was another woman who dared to defy the walls built around her, Empress Matilda, the daughter of a king who was never meant to kneel before anyone. Her story begins not in triumph, but in a quiet promise made and later broken, a promise that plunged England into years of chaos known as the Anarchy. Matilda was born to King Henry I of England, a ruler both cunning and ruthless, who sought to secure his dynasty after the tragic death of his only legitimate son in a shipwreck. With no male heir left, Henry did the unthinkable. He declared his daughter his successor. Every nobleman in his realm swore an oath of loyalty to her, to recognize her as queen when he died. It was a radical idea, almost unthinkable in a world ruled by men. For the first time, England was preparing to be led by a woman. But oaths in the Middle Ages were as fragile as parchment in flame. When Henry I died in 1135, his nephew Stephen of Blois raced to London, seized the treasury, and claimed the crown for himself. He was crowned king before Matilda could even return from Normandy. The same barons who had sworn loyalty to her bowed to him instead. And so began a war that would last nearly 2 decades, a brutal struggle between a rightful heir and a usurper, between legitimacy and ambition. Matilda refused to yield. She was not the kind of woman who wept behind closed doors or accepted fate as written. From the moment her claim was stolen, she became a force of will wrapped in steel. Chroniclers described her as proud, even haughty, but pride was her armor in a world that despised powerful women. She crossed the English Channel in winter, raised armies, forged alliances, and laid siege to the cities that had once sworn her loyalty. The war that followed was merciless. England descended into lawlessness, castles burned, fields turned to ash, and villages fell silent under the weight of fear. But amid the ruin, Matilda proved herself more than a symbol. She was a strategist. She negotiated with bishops, outmaneuvered barons, and even arranged daring escapes that became the stuff of legend. One night in 1141, trapped by Stephen's forces in the snow-covered city of Oxford, she slipped out under cover of darkness. Dressed in white to blend with the snow, she crossed the frozen river with only a handful of loyal knights. The frost bit through her boots, her breath turned to mist, but she survived. That escape became a whisper of defiance that carried across the realm the lady who would not fall. For a brief moment, victory seemed near. Her forces captured Stephen in battle, and Matilda entered London to claim the throne. But her triumph was short-lived. The city, stirred by rumors and resentment, rose against her. The same nobles who had praised her now called her arrogant. They said she lacked humility, that she forgot she was a woman. The irony was bitter. When she showed strength, they called her proud. Had she shown softness, they would have called her weak. Driven from London, Matilda fled once more, the crown slipping just beyond her reach. For years, she fought on, sometimes in armor, sometimes through diplomacy, until exhaustion and politics finally forced a stalemate. Though she never wore the crown, her resilience ensured her bloodline would. Her son, Henry Plantagenet, would one day become Henry II, founder of a dynasty that ruled England for centuries. In the end, her victory was indirect, but complete. Matilda's struggle revealed something the medieval world was not ready to accept: that a woman could possess both intellect and authority, both strength and strategy. She was not perfect, her temper was fierce, her patience thin, but her defiance carved a path for those who came after her. Without her endurance, there would have been no Eleanor of Aquitaine, no Richard the Lionheart, no Plantagenet legacy at all. In her later years, she retired to Normandy, governing her lands with precision and calm. She corresponded with bishops, advised her son, and remained a quiet architect of empire. When she died in 1167, the chroniclers did not call her queen, but they called her Domina Anglorum, Lady of the English. The title she was denied in life became her monument in death. Her story lingers as a lesson written between the lines of history, that sometimes power is not inherited through crowns or ceremonies, but through endurance. Matilda did not sit on a throne, yet she founded a dynasty. She did not receive loyalty, yet she commanded respect. And in her defiance, she proved something greater than any coronation could declare: that destiny, once claimed with courage, can outlive even the weight of failure. In the medieval world, marriage was rarely a matter of the heart. It was a transaction written in ink and sealed with bloodlines. Love was a luxury. Alliance was survival. For kings and queens, a wedding was not a personal milestone but a political event, an exchange of power disguised in vows and velvet. Every royal union carried the weight of strategy. Behind the music, the feasts, and the vows before God, treaties were being signed, territories promised, and futures rewritten. The clasping of hands at the altar could end wars or ignite them. A dowry could shift the balance of kingdoms. A single heir could decide the fate of dynasties. In this chessboard of power, affection had little say. A royal bride often met her husband for the first time on her wedding day. Many were children 12, 13, sometimes younger, sent across seas to marry strangers who spoke a different language and ruled lands they had never seen. Their innocence was not protected by the crown. It was used by it. To be born royal meant to become a tool of diplomacy before one had learned the meaning of choice. The Church sanctified these unions, cloaking them in divine legitimacy. Marriage was not just a contract between two families but a covenant before God. To defy it was to risk excommunication, even damnation. Yet beneath this sacred veil, politics thrived. Kings married princesses to secure borders, queens were offered as peace offerings, and widows were remarried to bind restless factions. Each match was a gamble, an attempt to turn love into leverage. For queens, marriage could be both throne and prison. A husband's death might free her or doom her. Widowed queens often became pawns in the next political game, remarried without consent or forced into cloisters. But some learned to play the game themselves. They wielded influence through counsel, persuasion, or the quiet power of motherhood. A well-placed word in the king's ear could shift alliances. A well-born son could secure the line for generations. The most dangerous role, however, was that of the royal wife without an heir. Childbirth was both a duty and a test. A queen's body was the kingdom's future. Her womb, a battlefield where legitimacy was won or lost. The pressure to produce sons was relentless, and failure often meant disgrace or replacement. Even the most devoted kings were not immune to the lure of politics. They could annul marriages, declare sterility divine will, or simply take mistresses to secure what God seemed to deny. Consider Catherine of Aragon, centuries later, cast aside after years of loyalty because she could not bear a living son. Or Isabella of France, who turned from queen to conspirator after her husband's neglect. These stories echoed through medieval halls long before their names were written, proof that royal marriage was not sanctuary but struggle. Yet among these calculated unions, there were rare flickers of real affection. Some kings and queens grew to respect, even love each other, over years of shared burden. They found comfort not in romance but in partnership. When Philippa of Hainaut married Edward III of England, theirs began as a political match but became one of quiet loyalty. She accompanied him through wars, prayed for his victories, and acted as regent when he was away. In her presence, Edward was said to soften. Her counsel tempered his wrath. When she died, he wept openly, an act rare for a king trained never to show weakness. Still, such tenderness was the exception, not the rule. Most royal couples performed affection the way they performed piety, for the stability of the realm. Their lives were watched, their words recorded, their children counted as assets. Even their intimacy belonged to history. Behind the glittering crowns and embroidered veils, marriage in the Middle Ages was a negotiation between faith and fear, between human longing and political necessity. The vows for better or for worse were not about emotion but empire. And yet, for all the manipulation and ambition, these unions built the map of Europe as we know it. Borders shifted because two hands met at an altar. Wars ended because a bride crossed a sea. Dynasties rose and fell because of what was whispered between husband and wife in candlelight. In the end, royal marriage was never about two people. It was about everyone who lived beneath their rule, the soldiers who fought for their heirs, the peasants who paid for their feasts, the chroniclers who would turn their tangled lives into legend. Power was born not only on battlefields but in bridal chambers. And for those who wore the crown, every kiss, every child, every broken vow became part of the long, uneasy marriage between love and power itself. If power was the backbone of monarchy, culture was its voice. The medieval court was not only a center of politics and ceremony, it was a living stage where art, architecture, and intellect were used to shape identity, justify authority, and whisper a kind of immortality into stone and parchment. Kings ruled with armies, but they were remembered through what they built, sponsored, and inspired. Every great ruler understood this. Cathedrals that soared into the clouds, illuminated manuscripts glowing with gold leaf, tapestries woven with stories of conquest and faith, these were not merely ornaments of wealth. They were the public face of divine legitimacy. When a king built a church, he was not just honoring God. He was carving his name into eternity. When a queen patronized poets and painters, she was crafting the emotional texture of her reign. Culture was propaganda, yes, but also prayer. Walk into a medieval cathedral, and you feel the pulse of that ambition. The vaults seem to defy gravity, each arch pointing toward heaven as if tugging the soul upward. Light streams through stained glass, casting colored halos on cold stone, saints and angels frozen in silence, watching the faithful below. Every inch of those walls was a message. This kingdom is blessed, this ruler chosen. Faith and artistry joined hands to build monuments of power that outlived the men and women who paid for them. Royal courts, meanwhile, became centers of creative ferment. Bards, chroniclers, painters, and architects gathered like moths to candlelight. Kings demanded songs that celebrated their victories. Queens requested romances that softened their image. In a world of illiteracy, art was the language of the people. A mural could teach loyalty where words could not. A song could travel farther than an edict. Eleanor of Aquitaine, in her court at Poitiers, had already turned poetry into diplomacy. She invited troubadours to sing of courtly love, a philosophy that celebrated devotion, restraint, and emotional nobility. It was a dangerous idea. In its own way, it gave feeling a place in a world ruled by duty. From those verses would bloom centuries of chivalric ideals: the courteous knight, the virtuous lady, the belief that honor could be romantic. It was culture as quiet rebellion, and it spread across Europe like perfume on silk. Queens, often sidelined from the battlefield, became some of the most influential patrons of their age. Philippa of Hainaut, wife of Edward III, filled her household with scholars, artists, and musicians. She commissioned tapestries that recorded royal triumphs, not just as history but as performance. When she pleaded for mercy for the burghers of Calais, those condemned citizens who had surrendered their city, her compassion was immortalized in bronze centuries later. She turned moral virtue into art, and art into memory. Kings, too, sought beauty as a mirror of their might. Edward I built castles in Wales, Carnarvon, Conwy, Harlech, not just as fortresses but as works of architectural theatre. Their walls told stories of empire. Richard II patronized the poet Geoffrey Chaucer, whose Canterbury Tales gave voice to every rank of English society. And across the Channel, Louis IX of France, later canonized as St. Louis, built Sainte-Chapelle, a jewel box of light where relics of Christ's Passion gleamed beneath stained glass as delicate as breath. It was devotion and power fused into a single, radiant gesture. The royal image itself became an art form. Illuminated manuscripts showed kings haloed like saints, queens enthroned like Madonnas. Their faces were painted with calm authority, untouched by time or human weakness. These portraits were not likenesses. They were symbols designed to teach obedience, to sanctify hierarchy. Even the coins in a peasant's hand carried that image, a small daily reminder of the ruler's invisible presence. Yet the deeper magic of medieval patronage lay not in its grandeur but in its humanity. For all the posturing, art preserved what history often forgets: the laughter in the great hall, the solemn beauty of a chant echoing through a chapel, the quiet dignity of a mason carving angels into stone high above the ground. These moments, fragile and fleeting, became eternity. Culture softened the edges of power. It gave kings and queens a language beyond decree, a way to be remembered not just for the wars they fought, but for the beauty they left behind. In this sense, art was their confession, their hope for redemption. Long after the crowns had tarnished and the banners faded, the light still poured through the stained glass, unchanged. So when we look at those cathedrals or read those poems today, we are not just seeing craftsmanship, we are hearing the echo of a longing that was deeply human. A longing to be understood, to be loved by posterity, to make the heavy business of ruling mean something beyond survival. In stone and song, they reached for grace. And through their art, they almost found it. Power attracts, but it also encloses. For medieval kings and queens, the throne was both pedestal and prison. They lived surrounded by people, courtiers, attendants, guards, priests, yet few truly saw them. The air inside a royal court was thick with ceremony, gossip, and calculation. Every word could become rumor, every gesture a political signal. To be royal was to exist in a crowd and still feel alone. The higher the crown, the narrower the world became. A monarch's movements were choreographed to the minute. Travel required escorts and endless logistics. Privacy, as we understand it today, did not exist. Even sleep was a public act. Chambers were shared with servants and guards. When the king bathed, the court observed. When the queen gave birth, noble women stood witness to ensure the legitimacy of the heir. Their bodies belonged not to themselves but to the realm. Court life moved with an elegance that concealed its strain. A typical day might look like a sequence of splendor: meals in the great hall, petitions heard in council, prayers, hunts, feasts. But each scene was a cage lined with gold. A wrong word to a bishop, an unguarded look toward a rival, even a hint of illness could unleash whispers that eroded a ruler's authority. Power demanded constant performance, and the mask could never slip. For queens especially, isolation could be absolute. They were watched by ladies-in-waiting, surrounded by servants chosen for loyalty to others. They were rarely left alone, even to write or pray. Many turned to letters carefully coded, smuggled through trusted hands as their only means of self-expression. Their words became their refuge, their rebellion, their record of endurance. Kings fared little better. Their solitude was heavier, wrapped in expectation rather than confinement. The world saw them as near divine, but in private moments they faced their own frailty, the knowledge that a dagger, a famine, or even a rumor could end the illusion of control. Some sought companionship in faith, others in secret affairs or midnight walks through the quiet corridors of their castles. Chroniclers wrote of monarchs who spoke to no one for days, who spent nights pacing beneath torchlight, haunted by the weight of decision. Even the architecture reflected this paradox. Castles were built for defense, but they also isolated. Thick stone walls muffled sound, cold corridors stretched endlessly, and drafty chambers echoed with the wind. The royal apartments were often elevated literally above everyone else, yet that height also separated them from warmth and conversation. A ruler could look out from the tower window and see their kingdom stretching for miles, yet be unable to touch a single life within it. The loneliness of power did strange things to people. Some monarchs hardened, building invisible walls between themselves and the world. Others became suspicious, seeing betrayal in every shadow. A few broke completely, driven to madness by the constant pressure to appear infallible. Chroniclers softened the language, calling them melancholic or touched by divine madness, but the truth was simpler: they were human beings collapsing under divine expectations. For those who endured, isolation became a kind of discipline. It taught them restraint, taught them to think before speaking, to measure before acting. It forced reflection, and in rare cases, humility. A few even came to see solitude as sacred, a thin place between the world of men and the will of God. These moments, brief as they were, gave meaning to a life otherwise scripted by duty. So, while poets and painters celebrated royal splendor, behind the images lay silence, the quiet that filled the space after the feasts, after the music faded, after the courtiers withdrew. In that silence, kings and queens became just souls in heavy robes, yearning for something no title could give, to be seen not as symbols, but as people. And perhaps that is the most human truth hidden within all the gold and marble of medieval monarchy. That even surrounded by hundreds, one can still be terribly alone. Gold was the language of power in the medieval world. Every gem, every robe, every banquet was part of a grand illusion, a performance meant to convince subjects that their ruler's authority came not from human hands, but from heaven itself. To rule was to embody abundance, to appear unshakable even when the treasury ran dry or enemies gathered at the border. In a time when survival was uncertain for most, the monarch's wealth had to seem infinite. The royal regalia, the crown, scepter, orb, and sword were more than ornaments. They were sacred instruments, each representing a promise between ruler and realm. The crown was the sign of divine favor, the scepter of justice, the orb of dominion over the world. To touch them was to risk sacrilege. During coronations, these symbols were handled with ritual precision. The archbishop anointed the monarch's forehead with holy oil, lifted the crown as though it were a flame, and set it upon the royal head in a silence so deep that even the courtiers held their breath. In that moment, power became spectacle, faith made visible. But the illusion had to be maintained every day, not just at the altar. Wealth was displayed through clothing and ceremony. Monarchs wore furs from distant lands, fabrics threaded with gold, jewels cut from stones carried by caravans across deserts. Even color spoke of hierarchy: purple, reserved for emperors; crimson and deep blue, for the highest ranks. To appear plain was to risk seeming weak. To appear too lavish invited envy and sin. The art of royal presentation lay in balance, the mastery of radiance without excess. Banquets were another kind of theater. Hundreds of dishes might be served at a single feast: roasted swans, gilded pies, sugar sculptures shaped into castles or angels. Music filled the hall while torches reflected off silver goblets and polished armor. Yet beneath the laughter and spectacle, these events carried political meaning. Each seat at the table signaled favor. Each gift of meat or wine was a calculated gesture. To dine with the king was to be seen, to be chosen, and to be absent was its own quiet punishment. Even architecture became part of this symbolic vocabulary. Castles rose like stone prayers, visible from miles away, a constant reminder of the ruler's reach. Inside, walls gleamed with tapestries depicting victories, saints, and virtues. Every fresco and carving whispered the same message: this monarch was chosen, this realm ordained. When foreign envoys entered the hall, they were not meant to feel comfortable. They were meant to feel awe. But such grandeur came at a cost. Royal treasuries were never bottomless. Wars, crusades, and construction drained fortunes faster than taxes could replenish them. Monarchs borrowed from merchants and the church, pawned jewels, even melted down relics to pay soldiers. Still, they could never show weakness. The gold had to shine, even if it was borrowed light. Wealth was also a weapon. Coins bore the monarch's face, circulating his image into every hand that traded or tithed. When subjects saw that familiar profile stamped in silver, they were reminded who ruled their lives. Art and currency alike became instruments of persuasion, teaching obedience through repetition. Even in the remotest village, where no one had ever seen the king, His likeness glimmered on coins beside the bread they bought. For queens, jewels and garments were political armor. A necklace could signal alliance. A brooch could carry the emblem of peace or inheritance. When a queen appeared before her court, her attire spoke before she did. Chroniclers described her in shimmering metaphors clothed in light, a second dawn. Yet beneath the glitter, many of those women lived under immense pressure to embody perfection. Their beauty was public property, their elegance proof of divine order. And when famine or war struck, those same symbols became dangerous. The people who once marveled at royal splendor could turn resentful, seeing luxury as insult. Gold that once signified divinity became proof of distance, of indifference. Wise rulers learned to temper their display, appearing generous without seeming wasteful, pious without seeming poor. In truth, much of medieval wealth was illusion. Castles leaked, roads crumbled, and court silks hid debts that could ruin kingdoms. Yet the performance worked because it offered something the people needed to believe, that amidst chaos and hunger, there was at least one thing untouched by decay. The crown was more than metal, it was faith made visible, a symbol of endurance in a world that rarely offered certainty. And perhaps that was its greatest power. Not the gold itself, but the story it told. That order could exist, that someone, somewhere, had been chosen to stand between the fragile earth and the infinite sky. Strip away the jewels, the banners, the titles, and what remains is simply a person, caught between duty and desire. Beneath the crown's gleam, kings and queens were not gods, but mortals learning to breathe under the weight of expectation. They suffered fevers, they mourned children, they quarreled with spouses. They feared betrayal, loneliness, and the slow erosion of trust. Yet they had to wear serenity like armor, smiling before their court while doubt gnawed quietly beneath the gold. Chroniclers rarely wrote about their fragility. To do so would have been dangerous. History preferred its monarchs' unshaken figures of divine certainty. But in private, the mask sometimes slipped. Letters revealed their fatigue. A queen pleading for her husband's affection. A king confessing guilt to a monk. A ruler who dreaded sleep because it brought the faces of the dead. They were born into crowns they never asked for and bound to roles they could never escape. Consider Edward II, mocked by his nobles and undone by his own heart, trapped between the expectations of a king and the longings of a man. Or Isabella of France, his queen, forced to smile beside him while gathering the strength to rebel. Power made them both actors in a tragedy too vast to step out of. Their downfall was not only political, it was deeply human, driven by love, betrayal, and exhaustion. Even the most celebrated rulers carried invisible bruises. Richard the Lionheart, whose name thundered across continents, spent years imprisoned, chained in foreign lands, writing poems of sorrow and regret. Henry IV battled illness and paranoia, convinced that divine wrath shadowed every decision. Elizabeth of Hungary starved herself in mourning for a husband lost to crusade. Behind every coronation stood a life that was never truly theirs to live. For queens, the performance was often crueler. Their worth was measured not by wisdom but by wombs, their bodies turned into vessels of lineage. They endured childbirth after childbirth, sometimes alone, sometimes bleeding beneath embroidered sheets while priests murmured prayers outside the door. Some survived. Many did not. Those who did learned to hide their fear behind stillness to appear serene even as the world demanded more of them than any mortal could give. And yet, despite it all, they loved. Not always wisely, not always safely, but deeply. Some wrote tender letters in secret. Others prayed for the souls of men who had wronged them. They found beauty where they could, a garden in bloom, a piece of music echoing through the chapel, a moment of laughter at supper when rank and ritual briefly fell away. These small mercies stitch their humanity together. It is easy to think of royalty as untouchable, but the truth is quieter. Power did not erase pain, it only magnified it. To be a monarch was to live beneath 1,000 eyes, yet to feel unseen. To rule millions, yet control so little of one's own heart. They could command armies but not affection. Decree peace but not silence the grief that came with it. In their solitude, many turned inward. Some sought meaning in faith, building monasteries or endowing hospitals in repentance. Others drowned themselves in grandeur feasts, hunts, conquests to forget the silence waiting in their chambers. A few, like Eleanor of Aquitaine and Matilda, transformed that pain into resilience, refusing to vanish into the margins history reserved for women. They became not victims of their crowns, but their keepers. To see the human beneath the crown is to see history differently. It reminds us that the stories we inherit, the portraits, the myths, the titles are only half-truths. The rest lives in the spaces between. In the sigh before a public speech, in the letter burned before dawn, in the eyes of a monarch staring out from a balcony, wondering if power was worth the loneliness it demanded. And maybe that is the quiet paradox of royalty. The higher they rose, the further they drifted from what they were meant to protect, the simple, unguarded life that existed beyond the gates. They ruled kingdoms, but they never ruled themselves. Centuries fade, and yet the echoes of those lives still linger, woven into stone, song, and story. The kings and queens of the medieval world are long buried, but their shadows stretch across time, shaping how we imagine power, love, and faith even now. What remains of them is not just the marble effigies or the faded crests in cathedral windows, but the questions they leave behind. What does it mean to lead? To serve? To live beneath the weight of expectation and still seek humanity within it? Their legacy is complicated, as all legacies are. For every act of tyranny, there was a gesture of mercy. For every war waged in pride, a chapel was built in repentance. They were neither heroes nor villains, but the uneasy combination of both. Their stories remind us that history is not a mirror polished to perfection, it is a window clouded by human breath. The castles they built still stand, though their walls no longer hear prayers or conspiracies. Cathedrals still draw sunlight through stained glass, turning cold air into color. Those stones have outlived their builders, but they still carry the same heartbeat, the longing to be remembered, the wish to matter beyond the brief spark of one life. In a strange way, that makes medieval royalty feel closer to us, not farther. We, too, leave traces behind, some in words, some in actions, some in silence. If you look closely, their lives are mirrors of our own. They struggled with the same fears. To be loved, to be understood, to be forgiven. The difference was only in scale. Their choices moved armies, while ours moved smaller worlds. But the core of it, the fragile humanness beneath the roles, never changes. Perhaps that is why these stories still hold us. We do not return to them for the politics or the pageantry, but for the glimpse of ourselves reflected in their contradictions. In Eleanor's defiance, we see the hunger for freedom. In Matilda's endurance, the quiet rebellion against fate. In their prayers and solitude, we recognize our own search for meaning in a world that rarely makes sense. History often celebrates power, but what endures are the small, unguarded moments, the mercy of a queen who spares her enemies, the courage of a ruler who admits fear, the tenderness of a letter written by candlelight. Those fragments survive because they are human. They remind us that beneath every crown beats a heart that wanted, just as we do, to live fully and be remembered kindly. And so, as we close this chapter on medieval royalty, the question that lingers is not about their wealth or conquests. It is simpler, in the centuries after the pageantry has faded, what remains of a life? For kings and queens, The answer lies not in gold or glory, but in the stories still whispered about them and the lessons they left behind, both noble and flawed. Their crowns may rest now in glass cases, but their choices ripple still. Their legacies remind us that power is temporary, yet the humanity within it, its doubts, its kindness, its longing endures. Perhaps that is the truest inheritance they gave us, the understanding that even those who seemed larger than life were, in the end, only trying to find their place in it. And somewhere, in the hush of an old cathedral, or the ruins of a castle open to the wind, their silence still speaks not of triumph or defeat, but of the same simple truth that outlasts all thrones. That to be human, even for a moment, is the only kind of royalty that truly lasts. And so we arrive at the quiet end of the journey. The torches in the great hall have burned low, the echo of footsteps has faded from the stone corridors, and the crown once blazing with light rests in the stillness of memory. We have walked through centuries of ceremony and struggle, through the cold of castles and the warmth of prayer, through the triumphs and sorrows of people who carried more than power, they carried the burden of being seen as something greater than human. Their stories, though wrapped in gold and ritual, are really about us. About the desire to be understood, the fear of failure, the need to leave something that lasts. Whether through cathedrals or compassion, through conquest or confession, they reach for meaning in the only way humans ever do, by living, stumbling, and hoping that the world remembers a softer version of them than history allows. So, as we close tonight's tale, let the grandeur settle into quiet. Imagine the candlelight dimming across the old stones, the crown fading back into shadow. Power passes, but the human heart endures, and perhaps that is the truest legacy of all. Thank you for spending this time in history's hush with me. May your night be calm, your thoughts unhurried, and your dreams touched by just a hint of medieval wonder. Until the next story, rest well.